You, my friends, are just in time to Take a Shift, a revolutionary podcast hosted weekly by yours truly, Belinda and Catherine, that will literally alter the trajectory of your life.
We're on a mission to listen, ignite, and transform, challenging ourselves and you, dear listener, to journey deeper and get uncomfortable. Discover what lies beyond those layers of fear, judgment, smallness, and everything else that's been getting in your way up until now. Choose to step into new possibilities and courageously wake up to the life you know you were meant to be living.
So buckle up, Buttercup, summon your curiosity, and together, let's take a shift.
Welcome to this week's podcast, Take a Shift. It's podcast number 11, and we're focusing on relationship conflict today. I'm your host, Belinda Zilberman. My beloved best friend, soul partner, Catherine Hart, won't be joining us today as she's still on the East Coast with her family mourning the passing of her niece, Caroline. So I'm going solo today. It's another experiment, and I hope you will have patience with me as I navigate hosting a podcast on my own. So last month at the end of January, we started a series we called the Conflict Series, and the first podcast in that series was on reframing conflict. And we had a nice long discussion about what that means. And this podcast, the second in the series, we're going a little deeper into relationship conflict. It's a juicy one. I'm not sure where we're going to end up, but I thought I would start by reading something that I wrote not so long ago, just as I was thinking about relationship conflict and its origins, and see if this brings forth anything as we're starting today. So I titled this Relationship Conflict, Maybe It's Time to Consider the Big Picture. For anyone who knows me, they will say that I'm a wanderer and an explorer. I recently heard from a colleague that after 2 decades making a home in one city, she and her husband were picking up and moving to South America for 2 years, the timing coinciding with her youngest child leaving the house. This brought me back to my own hopes and dreams to do the same one day, how I sometimes count the years until my daughter and stepson will graduate high school, and I can go back to what I feel are my quote-unquote roots, which aren't conventional roots at all, but a desire to see everything, go everywhere, be a part of this incredible world with no attachment to a particular place. And all of this pondering brought me back to one of the keys to a successful relationship. Do you and your partner see eye to eye in the big picture? Said in another way, are you on that same soul journey? Will the directions you are each going in fulfill you at that deeper level so that you may, in witnessing each other, become your most authentic expression of yourself? If you were to say to your partner that a month after your youngest child goes to college, you're getting on an airplane to some exotic land, would she be in the seat next to you? If the answer is no, then maybe it's time to have a conversation. After many years of observing couples and breakups and all the reasons for the conflicts, I think this lack of clarity of a joint big picture trumps the money, time, kids, lack of sex or intimacy, and all other reasons for relationships to end. Because what is a relationship after all but a commitment to go somewhere, do something bigger than what you might be able to do on your own? And if in all of your big dreams you envision yourself alone, then you have to ask, what is this primary relationship about? When I asked my first husband after about 5 years together where he saw himself 30 years in the future, he told me on a mountaintop alone. It was time to have that conversation and time for me to realize that our paths were not parallel, and it was time to start letting go and eventually separate to discover what would support each of us in our long-term dreams and visions. It is not easy. It takes some difficult conversations that can feel so sad. And yet, which is sadder? A life half lived where two people hold each other back by the fact that they don't share the same dream? Or a life fully lived with breakups and separations where people experience fully their individuality and reach their dreams? I'm still discovering and still testing the waters, and I know for sure I don't have the answers. But one thing I do know is that I prefer the latter. I have big dreams, and my commitment to honest and authentic relationship supports my long-term big picture in becoming a reality. So I wanted to share that because there's so many different ways that we could start this conversation around relationship conflict. And as I talk about in that writing, it has been my experience that we can have all of sort of the micro conversations of what's getting in the way of two people connecting and seeing eye to eye. And the number one thing I hear people come in with, the very number one thing they say is communication issues. It's most of the time it's we don't know how to communicate. Sometimes it's he doesn't listen to me, or she doesn't understand me, or we don't see eye to eye on how to raise our kids or how to spend our money or all of this. I've talked in recent podcasts about this idea of the content of our lives and the context of our lives. And I think this brings us back to that idea again. You know, the content is all of these decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis, and how we deal with conflict when it comes up, and what we fight about, and et cetera, et cetera. The context is really, you know, what's that container that we set up? And if we're going to use the big picture as an example, what's that big picture? What are we aiming for? What do we think is a priority in terms of our core values, in terms of what we really think is important? And I think that for most couples that I've worked with, even if they've gone to therapy for years, they were often working on the content of their lives and not the context. And I think when I consider relationship conflict, that is probably one of, if not the biggest issue. We're not talking about why we're in relationship to begin with. We're not talking about the container that we individually create. And when we come together, we sort of say, hey, this is my container. This is my context for being in relationship. What's yours? We're talking about the things that we like to do. We're talking about physical attraction. We're talking about maybe some values that we have from our family, or some values that we've come to understand as adults. But this idea of a bigger picture of really why are we in relationship to begin with, I think is the key. There were a couple of points that I wanted to focus on in terms of creating that container. And I would say these are ideas that I adhere to. And whether I'm in a relationship conflict with my husband, or I'm working through some conflict from the past and trying to resolve it inwardly, this is what frames that process for me. So I was just going to go down and read a couple of points and then share some thoughts about that. Number one, every conflict in relationship is trying to communicate something to you. I think that for about the first 40 years of my life, the way that I viewed conflict was, if I was in conflict, it meant I had done something wrong. I had done something bad. I was wrong. I was bad. I should be ashamed, and I'm a bad person. That's a pretty heavy load to haul. Listen to the statement again. Every conflict in relationship is trying to communicate something to you. For 40 years of my life, until I really got this in my bones, I wasn't actually able to get enough distance to separate myself from the conflict to be able to sit and consider and get curious. particularly in those conflicts that were happening over and over and over and over again, whether it was with the same person, my sister, for example, that I just couldn't seem to get out of certain ruts of having the same kind of conflict. Anything could spark it, but it was the same kind of conflict that was happening over and over again. Or if it was different partners, and in fact, two husbands, where different people, different content of our lives, but the conflict felt the same and just kept happening again and again. And for me, as someone who was looking for peace in relationship, in spite of what some of my family and friends would say, given that I was in and around conflict a lot of the time, I always knew intuitively that diving into the conflict and being in and around the conflict was because I wanted to bring peace to it. I wanted to help dissolve it. But one of the things that I was not connecting to was the fact that all this judgment that I was making about myself every time a conflict arose didn't enable me to pause for even a minute and understand that there was potentially a bigger opportunity here. I was too caught up in all of this self-judgment and frankly judgment of the person I was in conflict with to be able to take a step back and say, what's really going on here? Many of you out there might have been better at this early on in your life than me. I guess I'm a slow learner in some cases, and conflict sort of, like shifting the paradigm of conflict being my life. I look at it now as I really needed to get in there and get into a lot of conflict to be able to learn some of these lessons. So when I say every conflict and relationship is trying to communicate something to you, it's really like to not make it as a statement per se, but make it as a question. Like, as you're navigating conflict in your own life, what if you paused and said, what is this conflict trying to communicate to me? And this goes back to this idea of reframing conflict. What if this conflict was in fact for me and not against me? Now, when I say that, I'm not saying the conflict doesn't hurt, and I'm not saying the conflict isn't hard, and I'm not saying that the person on the other side might be wrong or done something really egregious. I'm not saying that. I'm saying for your own personal inquiry, to support you in personally navigating this conflict and potentially coming to a new insight and awareness, particularly again, if it's a conflict that feels like it keeps showing up time and time in your life, to pose this question and even consider it for a minute. You might be surprised at what you hear from your own inner wisdom. Number 2, everywhere you go, you are the common denominator. So no one knows better than me that I am the common denominator. I had dated and been in short-term relationships for almost a decade with, when I say short term, right, it could have been a week, 2 weeks, with many, many men. And in 2018 already, married my third husband. So no one knows better than me that I was desperately, desperately trying to have the best relationship on the planet. And the way that I was doing it was I would meet someone and I would get into a relationship. Something would go wrong and I would leave. Or sometimes the other person would leave first, but generally it would be me. And then I would go to the next person. And in not one, but 2 marriages, did the same thing. And my context up until my early 40s was, if there was relationship conflict happening, it must be that this person's the wrong person for me, or some variation of that. Or he did certain things that are so egregious that that's not the person for me. Or I just can't live XYZ situation with this person, so he must not be for me. This idea that everywhere I go, I am the common denominator really lent itself to a 3-year period of being single after getting divorced for the second time. And without judgment, again, being in an inquiry of, if I'm the common denominator, not going to, I must be the problem, or, oh, there really is something wrong with me, but rather sitting and saying, okay, so if I'm the common denominator, then it must be that something about the way I'm being, something the way that I'm perceiving this situation is what is having this kind of dynamic show up time and time again, because I have dated really different people, right? I'm in a relationship with a lot of people through work, through family, through community, etc. And I would find that the kind of conflict that would show up in my life time and time again was pretty similar with really different people. So this idea of sitting with yourself and considering, what is it, and I'm going to put it in this term, when you find yourself starting to feel like you're getting into conflict, you're starting to feel resistance in a relationship, you're starting to get sort of those body sensations that, if we again pause and listen to our body, we know, each of us, some of us it's in our throat, some of us it's in our back, some of us in our abdomen, where we start to get this tension, maybe in our jaw, where we're entering into that conflict again. If you start pausing when you're starting to feel some of these body sensations, and if you ask yourself, what is the unmet need here? Right? What is it that, I am trying to get here? What do I think that I need? It's a very different kind of conversation than what generally we're doing, which is, I want to be right, I want to look good, I want to be in control. That's generally what we're doing when we're fighting, and we're really not getting to those deeper levels of our subconsciousness. What we're trying to do here is sort of say, look, I'm trying to get something from this. Most of us aren't getting anything but anxiety and frustration, aggravation, anger, and a desire to leave when we're in conflict. So navigating relationship conflict then becomes an opportunity for us to understand what those needs are, what those unmet needs are, but at a deeper level, right? Oftentimes we're operating at this level of, I wish he would just do the dishes and that they were done when I got home. Or, I wish she would, give me a kiss and a hug when I walked home so that I could feel, loved. And we're looking at actions that we're hoping somebody else will do so that we'll get some need met. But oftentimes I don't think that the need that we're really trying to get met is met by this idea of how we think we're going to get the need met. So understanding you're the common denominator is an opportunity for you to explore more deeply, what do you really want in a relationship? And what are you trying to process and heal by being in this relationship? When conflict comes up, that is an opportunity for us to look at what is sort of the unresolved material from younger life that we are just repeating in our current relationship. So more on that on another podcast. Number 3, and this is a big one, and I think I'm only going to give you this one, and then we'll start bringing it to a close. A lot of things to ponder here. Relationships are a spiritual practice. I have had this lesson so many times in the last 10 years, where even as a conflict specialist, even as someone who can really sit with a presence of mind, a presence of body, in front of a couple having a really, really aggressive, heated argument, and I can sit there and be comfortable with that. Just like anyone, when I am in personal conflict myself with someone who I love, of course I don't want to be in conflict with someone who I love. I still continue to get opportunities on a regular basis to practice this. And this idea of relationships as a spiritual practice also helps us set this context Again, the container of why we're in relationships to begin with. Why, for many of us who have left relationships when the conflict got too great, right? The context of that is relationships should be easy, or relationships should be comfortable, or relationships should give me what it is that I want. And if I'm not getting that, then I'm out of here, right? That that strategy has worked for a lot of us, right? And we've divorced, or we've left long-term relationships, or we never get into long-term relationships, or we avoid conflict altogether by sort of being in short-term relationships until it starts to feel a little sticky, and then we leave. There's all kinds of strategies out there. I'm going to suggest that for the 50, 60, 70% of people out there who are either divorced, divorcing, or have left a long-term relationship, that strategy is not working anymore. And we need to come up with a different strategy. And coming up with a different strategy means we need to come up with a different idea about why we're in a relationship to begin with. Relationships as a spiritual practice means that we can enter into a relationship with a mindset that those conflicts, those struggles, those issues are actually part of the gift of being in a relationship. And I know that might sound kind of strange, but if you think about it, if you've been in love or been in a committed relationship, or you've had, you have people in your life you love, family members, friends, whoever, and you've experienced a big conflict and you've gone through it. You were willing to sit and move through it because for whatever reason, you told yourself, I'm not leaving this relationship. It could be with a parent, could be with your child, with a sibling, it might be with your spouse. You are committed to not leaving, and you move through the conflict. And on the other side of the conflict, you are grateful for the conflict because something happened, something transformative happened in that exchange. As hurtful as it may have been, as many tears as you might have cried during the conflict, you came out the other end. When I'm sitting with clients, whether they decide to get divorced or stay together, and I would say I've got about a 60-40 ratio right now of people deciding to divorce, at 60% people deciding to stay together. The one thing that I always ask couples to do is be willing to stay at the table through the entirety of the process. Because I think that we leave when it gets too uncomfortable because we still are operating from this idea that it's supposed to be comfortable. And again, I'm not saying I want love and grace and ease in my relationships as much as the next person. And I know what it's like to sit at that table and be honest and vulnerable and raw and be afraid that something I'm going to say to my husband is going to hurt him. And in the past, there have been many times where it has. But what happens on the other end when we allow ourselves to be that vulnerable and that honest, and when we can trust that the other person is going to sit at the other side of the table and receive our honesty and receive us in that exchange, that to me is when we're actually practicing relationships as a spiritual practice. We're getting beyond our emotional discomfort. We're getting beyond our physical discomfort, and certainly our mental discomfort, right? Our brains go crazy when we're in conflict and we want to do the fight, flight, freeze, numb strategy. That's what our brains are wired to do. Our emotions, when they just get too much, we want to go. It is not pleasant to sit there and feel those feelings. And yet, what's the price that we're paying for stopping those feelings from being felt? What's the price we're paying for fleeing and fighting and freezing and numbing, what's the price we're paying? And I'm suggesting in this podcast called Relationship Conflict, Navigating Relationship Conflict, that there is another possibility here. And in my personal experience, I didn't go too much into my experience, with this, but what I can say now in 9 years of marriage and 12 years of relationship with my co-parent, the father of my biological daughter, that the more I practice this, the more I'm willing to sit at the table, the more I'm willing to feel what I feel and not leave and not avoid or not jump into a fight and that defensiveness that, I've got my warrior shield on, the more I can be present and practice some of the practices like pausing, like asking questions, like getting curious, the richer, more honest, and more loving all of my relationships become. And I'm saying that about my husband, but I'm also saying that about my ex-husband. We had a 2-hour conversation today that was incredibly rich. It brought us to another level of honesty in our relationship. And I attribute it all to this idea that my relationships are a spiritual practice. There is something bigger happening by being in relationship with the people I'm in relationship with. And my job is to simply avail myself of that opportunity for learning, for growth, for loving, for receiving, for listening, and see what happens. So I think with that, we'll bring this podcast to a close. Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can find us on takeashiftnow.com and on social media. Catherine will, of course, be with us again next week. Can't wait to have her back. And I really, really appreciate you all being here and rooting me on in my first one-on-one podcast with you. Thank you, and see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Take a Shift, a part of Mental Health News Radio Network. We are so grateful for your time and presence. Always remember, you're just one shift away from a better feeling day in your life. Until next time, remember to listen, ignite, and transform. Much love from us to you.